The woman sitting across from Oprah Winfrey winced involuntarily as a cameraman adjusted his equipment with what appeared to be minor frustration, her body physically absorbing and translating his annoyance into a sharp sensation between her shoulder blades. At 36, Dr. Elena Rodriguez possessed what neurologists called mirror touch synesthesia, a rare condition that caused her to physically experience the emotions and sensations of everyone around her. What should have been a gift of extraordinary empathy had become a neurological prison where her own body served as a conductor for the emotional orchestra of humanity, playing every note of joy, pain, anxiety, and despair she encountered with overwhelming physical intensity. She wore a soft cream-colored cardigan and dark slacks, carefully chosen clothing that wouldn't amplify the sensory overload she experienced constantly. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, unconsciously trying to contain the physical manifestations of other people's emotional states that coursed through her body like electrical currents. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her dark brown eyes held the exhausted compassion of someone who had spent her entire adult life absorbing the pain of others without any mechanism for filtering or processing the emotional input. The familiar warmth of Harpo Studios buzzed around them, but Elena experienced it as a complex symphony of human emotion translated into physical sensation. The excitement of audience members manifested as tingling in her fingertips. The nervousness of production staff created a tight sensation in her chest, and the concentrated attention of 300 people watching her created a pressure behind her eyes that made it difficult to focus on Oprah's questions. Every person in the studio was unconsciously broadcasting their emotional state directly into Elena's nervous system, creating a cacophony of physical sensations that she had learned to navigate but never to silence. Oprah Winfrey sat in her signature chair, radiant in a deep turquoise silk blouse that immediately triggered, for Elena, a wave of warmth and confidence that Oprah was projecting. But Elena also felt the subtle undercurrent of concern that Oprah carried about a personal matter she was dealing with privately, manifesting as a gentle ache in Elena's lower back. Elena's condition meant that she experienced not just what people chose to show the world, but the complete spectrum of their emotional reality, including feelings they might not even be consciously aware of themselves. Today's show was dedicated to the science of empathy, a special episode highlighting professionals who had found ways to use their extraordinary sensitivity to human emotion in service of others. The producers had positioned Elena as a successful psychologist whose unusual empathic abilities had made her exceptionally effective at helping patients work through trauma and emotional difficulties. But Dr. Elena Rodriguez carried a secret that would transform this celebration of empathic gifts into something far more complex and heartbreaking. She had gotten on the show by presenting herself as someone who had learned to channel her mirror touch synesthesia into therapeutic success, a healer who could literally feel her patient's pain and thus help them process it more effectively. It wasn't entirely untrue. Her condition had made her an extraordinarily perceptive therapist, but the truth was that her empathic abilities were destroying her from the inside, creating a form of emotional overload that made normal life impossible and threatened to consume her entirely. Elena had first noticed her condition in early childhood, though it took years for anyone to understand what was happening to her. While other children seemed able to ignore or dismiss the emotional states of people around them, Elena found herself physically experiencing every feeling in her environment. When her mother was sad, Elena felt a crushing weight in her chest. When her father was angry, heat and tension flooded her muscles. When her younger brother was excited about Christmas morning, Elena's entire body buzzed with anticipatory energy that made it impossible for her to sleep. Initially, her parents and teachers assumed she was simply a sensitive child who needed to develop better emotional boundaries. But as Elena grew older, the true nature of her condition became apparent. She wasn't just emotionally sensitive. She was literally physically experiencing other people's emotions in her own body with the same intensity as if those feelings were her own. The condition had shaped every aspect of Elena's life in ways that were both remarkable and devastating. Her unusual empathic abilities had drawn her to psychology, where she discovered she could help patients in ways that seemed almost supernatural. She could sense when clients were holding back important information, could feel the physical locations where they carried emotional trauma, and could guide therapeutic conversations with an intuitive understanding of what patients needed to feel safe enough to heal. Elena had built a successful private practice, specializing in trauma therapy, where her ability to literally feel her patient's pain allowed her to provide exceptionally compassionate and effective treatment. Clients who had struggled for years with traditional therapists found breakthrough healing working with Elena, who seemed to understand their inner experience with impossible precision and depth. But the professional success came at an enormous personal cost. Elena's days were spent absorbing the trauma, depression, anxiety, and pain of dozens of clients each week. She would finish therapy sessions physically exhausted, carrying the emotional residue of every patient's suffering in her own nervous system. A session with a combat veteran dealing with PTSD would leave Elena's body tight with hypervigilance and jumpiness. Working with a survivor of childhood abuse would create lasting aches in areas where her client carried traumatic memories. Helping someone process grief would fill Elena's chest with the crushing weight of loss that could persist for days. Elena had tried various strategies for managing her condition: meditation, physical exercise, prescribed medication, therapeutic techniques designed to help caregivers avoid burnout. But nothing could prevent her nervous system from automatically translating other people's emotions into her own physical experience. She lived in a state of constant emotional input that made it impossible to distinguish her own feelings from those of everyone around her. Personal relationships had become particularly challenging. Elena couldn't have normal disagreements with romantic partners because she physically experienced their anger, hurt, or frustration as intensely as they did, creating a feedback loop where her physical reaction to their emotions amplified their distress, which in turn increased her physical symptoms. She had learned to avoid crowded places, social gatherings, and any situation where she might encounter intense or negative emotions from multiple people simultaneously. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier, when Elena realized she was spending more energy managing other people's emotional input than living her own life. She had reduced her client load to the minimum necessary to maintain her practice, had moved to a secluded apartment where she could minimize contact with neighbors' emotional broadcasts, and had essentially stopped participating in normal social activities because the emotional cost was too overwhelming. Elena had also discovered that her condition included an aspect that she had never discussed with colleagues or patients. She could sense emotional disturbances in people before they were consciously aware of them themselves. She could feel the early stages of panic attacks, the build-up to emotional breakdowns, and the subtle shifts that indicated someone was on the verge of making important psychological breakthroughs. This prescient quality made her an extraordinarily effective therapist, but also meant she was constantly bracing for emotional storms that hadn't yet fully manifested. That's what had brought her to Oprah's show today. After years of using her condition to help others while slowly destroying herself in the process, Elena felt compelled to share the hidden costs of extraordinary empathy. She hoped that speaking publicly about mirror-touch synesthesia might help other highly empathic people understand they weren't alone, might lead to better support for people with similar conditions, and might encourage a broader conversation about the difference between healthy empathy and pathological emotional absorption. The show's opening segments had featured inspiring stories about empathy and emotional intelligence. A teacher who had revolutionized conflict resolution in schools through empathy training. a nurse whose emotional sensitivity had led to breakthroughs in patient care, and a community organizer who had used empathic communication to heal racial tensions in her neighborhood. Each story was uplifting, each guest embodying the positive potential of enhanced emotional sensitivity. But when Oprah introduced Elena, something in her expression suggested she sensed this conversation might be different. Ladies and gentlemen, Oprah announced, "I want you to meet Dr. Elena Rodriguez." Elena is a psychologist who has spent the past 15 years helping people heal from trauma and emotional pain. What makes Elena extraordinary is her rare neurological condition called mirror touch synesthesia, which allows her to literally feel what her patients are experiencing. Today, she's here to share her insights about empathy, healing, and what it means to truly understand someone else's pain. Elena stood carefully, immediately overwhelmed by the wave of curiosity, excitement, and various personal concerns emanating from 300 audience members. The collective emotional input hit her nervous system like a physical force, creating sensations throughout her body that she had to consciously manage to remain functional. As she walked to the interview area, she felt not just her own nervousness but the anticipatory energy of everyone watching her. As they settled into their chairs, Oprah noticed the way Elena seemed to be processing far more than just the immediate conversation. Her attention constantly divided between the present moment and some kind of additional sensory input that only she could perceive. "Elena," Oprah began warmly, "tell us about mirror touch synesthesia and how it affects your work as a therapist." Elena had prepared to discuss the positive aspects of her condition, the ways it enhanced her therapeutic abilities, the insights it provided into human emotional experience. But sitting across from Oprah Winfrey, simultaneously, feeling Oprah's warm confidence, the cameraman's professional focus, the audience's mixed emotions, and her own overwhelming anxiety, the prepared responses felt inadequate to convey the true nature of her experience. "Oprah," she began, her voice steady despite the emotional chaos coursing through her nervous system. "Most people think of empathy as an emotional response, feeling compassion for someone who's struggling, being moved by someone else's joy or pain. But mirror touch synesthesia means I physically experience other people's emotions in my own body." She paused, unconsciously adjusting her posture as she felt a spike of anxiety from someone in the audience. "Right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm feeling your confidence and warmth as actual sensations in my body. A pleasant warmth across my shoulders and a sense of openness in my chest. But I'm also feeling the nervousness of the camera operator behind you as tension in my neck, the excitement of audience members as tingling in my arms, and the personal worry that someone in the third row is carrying as a knot in my stomach." The studio fell into unexpected quiet as people began to understand that Elena was describing something far more complex than enhanced emotional sensitivity. "Are you saying you can feel what everyone in this room is feeling?" Oprah asked gently. Elena's expression grew pained as she confronted the overwhelming nature of her daily experience. "Not just feel, physically experience," she clarified. "When someone is angry, I feel heat and tension in my muscles. When someone is sad, I feel weight and pressure in my chest. When someone is anxious, my heart rate increases and my breathing becomes shallow. It's not metaphorical or emotional. It's literally physical." She gestured toward the audience. "In this moment, I'm processing the emotional states of hundreds of people simultaneously. Someone in the back row is dealing with relationship problems, and I can feel that as a tight sensation around my heart. Someone else is excited about a job interview tomorrow, and that's creating energy in my legs that makes me want to move around. Another person is worried about a medical test result, and that anxiety is making my hands shake." The audience murmured uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their private emotional states were being broadcast directly into Elena's nervous system. "Elena," Oprah said softly. How do you function with that level of emotional input? Elena's voice took on the exhausted quality of someone who had been asked to explain an inexplicable burden countless times. I don't function well, she admitted. I've structured my entire life around minimizing emotional exposure. I live alone, work with a very limited number of clients, avoid crowds, restaurants, public transportation, any situation where I might encounter intense emotions from multiple people. Her voice grew more intense. People think being able to feel what others feel would make me a more compassionate person, a better therapist, and in some ways, it has. I can sense when clients are ready for difficult conversations. I can feel where they carry trauma in their bodies. I can guide therapy with unusual precision because I'm literally experiencing their healing process alongside them. She paused, wiping away tears that had formed as she absorbed sadness from someone in the audience. But the cost is that I can never turn it off. I carry the pain of every client I've ever worked with. I feel the depression of strangers on the street. I experience the anxiety of grocery store cashiers, the grief of people at funeral homes I drive past, the anger of couples arguing in restaurants I can never go to because the emotional input is too overwhelming. Oprah was visibly moved by Elena's description of emotional exile. How has this affected your personal relationships? Elena's laugh was bitter, tinged with years of isolation. I can't have normal relationships because I physically experience my partner's every emotion, she said. If they're frustrated with me, I feel their anger as heat and tension in my own body, which makes me defensive and anxious, which they then feel as rejection or withdrawal, which creates more frustration that I then feel even more intensely. She looked directly at Oprah. I can't argue with someone without experiencing their hurt feelings as crushing pain in my chest. I can't support someone through grief without carrying their sadness for weeks afterward. I can't celebrate someone's joy without being overwhelmed by energy that feels like electrical current running through my nervous system. The silence in the studio was profound as people contemplated what it would mean to live without emotional boundaries, to be unable to separate their own feelings from those of everyone around them. Elena, Oprah asked, can you give us a specific example of how your condition affects your daily life? Elena closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength to share something deeply personal. Last month, I was at the grocery store, trying to shop quickly to minimize exposure to other people's emotions, she began. But I encountered a woman in the dairy aisle who was quietly crying while looking at her shopping list. Immediately, I felt her despair as a crushing weight in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. Her voice became more emotional. I couldn't just walk away because her pain was literally inside my body. So I approached her and asked if she was okay. She broke down and told me she was trying to shop for groceries while going through a divorce, feeling overwhelmed by having to rebuild her entire life while taking care of two small children. Elena paused, reliving the experience. I spent 45 minutes in that grocery store, helping her work through her emotional crisis, because I couldn't leave while I was still physically experiencing her pain. By the time I got home, I was carrying her despair so intensely that I couldn't eat dinner, couldn't concentrate on anything, couldn't sleep that night because her emotional state had become mine. She looked at the audience. This happens constantly. I can't ignore other people's pain because I literally feel it in my own body. But I also can't help everyone I encounter without completely exhausting myself and losing all capacity for my own emotional life. That's when something unexpected began happening in the studio. Elena suddenly gasped and doubled over slightly, her hands pressed to her chest. Someone here is having a panic attack, she announced urgently, looking around the audience. Third section, about halfway back. You're feeling chest tightness, difficulty breathing, fear that something terrible is about to happen. Everyone turned to look where Elena was indicating, and they could see a middle-aged man who was indeed showing signs of distress, rapid breathing, pale complexion, obvious anxiety. "Sir," Elena called out, her voice carrying the authority of her therapeutic training. "Look at me and breathe slowly. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. You're safe. This feeling will pass." The man followed her instructions, and as his breathing normalized, Elena's own physical distress visibly decreased. "I felt his panic attack building for the past several minutes," Elena explained to Oprah and the audience. "The physical sensations he was experiencing, the racing heart, the chest tightness, the overwhelming fear, I was feeling all of it in my own body as it developed." Oprah was stunned. "You can predict when someone is about to have a panic attack?" "Not predict exactly," Elena clarified. "I feel the early stages of emotional and psychological states before people are fully conscious of them. I can sense when someone is on the verge of a breakdown, when they're about to have a breakthrough in therapy, when they're building up to making an important decision." She gestured toward the man who had been having the panic attack. "I felt his anxiety escalating for several minutes before it became a full panic response. This happens constantly. I'm always bracing for emotional storms that haven't fully manifested yet, feeling the early stages of other people's psychological experiences." The audience was completely silent now, watching someone demonstrate a form of human connection that was both remarkable and overwhelming. "Elena," Oprah said gently, "with all this emotional input, how do you take care of yourself? How do you maintain your own emotional health?" Elena's eyes filled with tears as she confronted the central challenge of her existence. "I don't," she whispered. "I don't know how to take care of myself when I'm constantly taking care of everyone else's emotional needs. I don't know how to have my own feelings when I'm always feeling other people's emotions more intensely than they do." Her voice broke as she continued. "I became a therapist because I thought my condition was a gift that I should use to help people, and I have helped people. I've guided hundreds of clients through trauma recovery, helped them heal from experiences they never thought they could overcome. But I've lost myself in the process." She looked directly at the camera. "I don't know what my own emotions feel like anymore. I can't distinguish between my happiness and someone else's joy, between my anxiety and the nervousness of strangers. I exist as a conduit for other people's emotional experiences, but I've forgotten how to have my own." That's when something profound happened. The audience, understanding the depth of Elena's sacrifice and isolation, began to respond with intentional emotional support. People started focusing on sending her feelings of gratitude, appreciation, and love. And Elena felt this collective positive emotion as a wave of warmth and energy that visibly transformed her posture and expression. They're sending me love," she said wonderingly. "I can feel hundreds of people focusing positive emotions toward me. It's like being wrapped in the warmest, safest embrace I've ever experienced." Oprah was crying now, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. An audience consciously using Elena's condition to provide her with the emotional support she had spent years giving to others without receiving in return. "Elena," Oprah said, "what do you want people to understand about living with such intense empathy?" Elena, still feeling the supportive energy from the audience, found her voice growing stronger. "I want them to understand that empathy without boundaries isn't a gift. It's a form of emotional drowning," she said. "The ability to feel what others feel can be beautiful and healing, but only if you also maintain the ability to feel your own emotions, to distinguish between your experiences and someone else's pain." Her voice grew more passionate. "I want people to know that healthy empathy requires limits, that you can't help others heal if you're absorbing their pain so completely that it destroys your own emotional equilibrium. I want them to understand that some neurological differences that seem like superpowers are actually disabilities that require support and accommodation." She looked around the studio at the audience that was still consciously sending her positive emotions, And I want them to know that emotional support works both ways. If you have someone in your life who gives freely of their emotional energy, who helps you process your feelings, and supports you through difficult times, please remember to give back. Please remember that healers need healing too. As the show concluded, Dr. Elena Rodriguez found herself embraced by Oprah while still feeling the conscious emotional support of 300 audience members who had learned to use her condition to provide her with something she had rarely experienced. The feeling of being emotionally held, supported, rather than constantly giving without receiving. In the months that followed, Elena's interview sparked important conversations about empathy, emotional boundaries, and the hidden costs of caregiving professions. She began working with other highly empathic individuals, developing support groups and therapeutic techniques for people who struggled with emotional overload and boundary issues. Elena also learned to communicate her needs more clearly, to ask for the emotional support she had spent years providing to others, and to recognize that her extraordinary empathic abilities were valuable precisely because they were rare and should be protected rather than depleted. The interview became a touchstone for healthcare professionals, therapists, and anyone in caregiving roles who struggled with emotional burnout and boundary issues. It reminded viewers that empathy is most healing when it flows both ways, that emotional givers need to also be emotional receivers, and that some gifts are too precious to give away without ensuring that the giver is also being sustained. Elena learned that being an emotion collector was not about absorbing everyone's pain, but about learning to hold space for others' feelings while maintaining her own emotional integrity. Her greatest therapeutic insight came from recognizing that healthy empathy requires not just the ability to feel what others feel, but the wisdom to know when to feel your own feelings instead. The emotion collector's gift was not her capacity to absorb unlimited emotional input, but her growing ability to transform that input into healing, both for others and finally for herself.